everybody, it's Rachel and Mallory here, and today we are on Jekyll Island, but we are actually in the marsh. So we are in a salt marsh, which is one of the habitats here on Jekyll Island. Now you might be familiar with our exhibit at the Flint River Aquarium. We do have a tidal marsh exhibit with, we have two really cute terrapins in there, but this one is a little bit bigger than our exhibit on the Flint River Aquarium, and we're going to learn a little bit more about it today.
And salt marshes in Georgia in particular are really important and really cool, and we have a lot of that habitat in our state. There's over 300,000 acres of salt marsh along the coastline of Georgia, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we explore into the marsh and see how all of these different plants and animals that make this place their home are adapted to living in this ever-changing environment.
You ready to go explore?
Yes.
All right, let's go. So this part of the marsh is called the Hammock. I remember it being called the Hammock because it's really the only place where you could hang your hammock if you wanted to come out into the marsh and relax, because it's the only spot in the marsh that actually has trees. So it is actually the only part in the marsh that is it's the highest point in elevation, which it isn't actually a lot, but it's just enough for it to have a wide diversity of plant life to grow here. It is the only spot that has trees. We can see we've got some cedars and some cabbage palms growing around here. And the reason why they all grow here is because this is the only spot where they are able to escape the salt water or the brackish water. These guys do not do well in salty environments, so that's why they hang out here on top of these hammocks. And we also have some other plant life like this prickly pear here. And so this is the hammock, and it's got the most diversity in the marsh.
So here in the salt marshes and tidal marshes of Georgia, there is a predominant plant of this tall grass right here. There's several different species, but it is Spartina or Spartina grass. And it's super cool. It's in the sugarcane family, and it is a staple in this environment. And the little animals that you see on the grass, they are called periwinkle snails, and they actually move up and down the grass as the tide comes in and out, because they don't want to be under the water, in the water when the tide comes in. So right now it's low tide and the snails are kind of making their way down the grasses and across the mud, but when the tide starts coming back in, they'll go back up the grasses to escape the water. They're super cool and cute. They're one of the main ingredients in the diet of diamondback terrapins as well, which is why they have those adapted hard beaks so they can munch on these little snails.
All right, so probably one of the most abundant animals living in the marsh, something you'll notice right away is that it's filled with these little crabs, and these are called fiddler crabs. They get their name because the males have this really big claw right here. Now the females, we got a female right here, they don't have one really big claw, and so the reason why the males have this is because they use it to try and impress those females. So around springtime is when they'll mate, and the males will use that really big claw and they'll move it up and down in a sort of a courtship dance to impress all of those female lady friends of theirs. And if they're the one with the biggest, baddest looking claw and the best dance moves, then they get to mate with the female. So gentlemen out there, just remember, if you really want to impress the ladies, you got to be a good dancer. If you take a notice at these two males, one claw is on its right and the other claw is on its left. So all males are born with their really big claw on their right, but they can lose it. A lot of times it's as a defense mechanism, so if a predator is coming after them, they'll drop that claw to then able to distract the predator and they can get away. Now they can grow those claws back. So what will happen is if a male loses their right claw, they will grow back a little claw and their left one will start to get really, really, really big. And then they'll just use their left claw for their dance instead. And then if they end up losing that left claw for another reason, then their right one will start to grow really, really big and their left one will come in really small. So it can alternate as they lose those claws back and forth. Fiddler crabs are really, really important because one, they are at the bottom of the food chain. Lots of birds and raccoons and turtles love to eat them. They're very, very tasty. And then they also burrow into the sand and into the mud. In the process of the burrowing,
and there's a bumblebee.
The process of that burrowing can help aerate the soil in the mud here. It is very anaerobic in the marsh, which meaning that there's not a lot of oxygen, so them burrowing into the soil can help aerate that soil a little bit. Which, let's go find some crab holes and we can take a look at them.
Yep.
So these holes are the burrows that the crabs use to dig out, and that's where they kind of stay and live in there. They run into there for protection. And if you look, you can see these clumps of sand. So we have these larger balls right here, and that's the ones that they use to dig out the clumps of sand to make those burrows. And it's actually the male's job to make sure that the burrow hole is kept clean. But if you see, we also have these tiny little balls right here. Now these are called Pseudo Feces. So what that actually means is fake poop. So it's not actually the fiddler crab's poop. But what it is what fiddler crabs like to eat is the marsh mud. So they'll get a big old clump of marsh mud and suck up all the nutrients that's in it, all the good stuff that they can use, until what's left is just sand. And sand doesn't really have a lot of nutrients. I don't know about you, but it's not really tasty to eat, and they don't want to eat it either, so then they'll just spit it back up because they can't really use it anymore. So all these little pseudo feces balls are just sand that they have to eat.
So where I am standing in the marsh now is a section of the habitat called a salt pan. It's rather large and kind of looks like a big frying pan, so it's an easy way to remember it. What happens is as the tide comes in and out and in and out, it's that brackish salt water. So the tide will come in and maybe it's a sunny day or an overcast day, kind of like today, and the water kind of sits there, and we all know what happens when water is out in the sun. The water evaporates and the salt is left. And so over time you have these higher depositions of salt in areas, and the deposition of salt is so great and so high that nothing can grow there. While these plants are all adapted and can live in salty areas, they are not so adapted that they just only like salt, which is what this area is salt and mud.
So behind me, you can see that there is a hammock behind me, but then these low-lying plants right here is part of the high marsh. So the high marsh you can usually find just sitting below hammocks. They are a little bit lower in elevation, and but not as low as the low marsh. That's why they're the high marsh. And in the high marsh, you can find a lot of halophytes. And halophytes are plants that have found adaptations to deal with the influx of salt water. So the ones that you see behind me that have those yellow flowers, those are called the sea oxide. We also have down here, these ones are called glasswort. And actually deer really like to eat glasswort. And it's said that if you like to hunt deer or anything, and you eat that deer that's been living in the marsh and eating glasswort, that it kind of has a salty taste to it. But one of my favorites is this one right here. I'll pick off a strand. And this is called sea pickle. And how sea pickle deals with the salt water is they actually take in all that salt water and then send a lot of the salt to 2 or 3 of their leaves. And those leaves are going to turn yellow and eventually die. So if you take a look, they have these really succulent leaves to kind of hold and store water, which is important, especially when you need fresh water to survive. So you want to hold on to it. And these ones down here are kind of yellow. So those have most of the salt concentrations in it, and so they're turning yellow and start to die. But that means that these green ones are a little bit more fresh, and they are actually edible. They still kind of have like a little bit of a salty tinge to them, but that is how the sea pickle survives in this salty environment. So as you can see, we've got some more Spartina Alterniflora right here, which makes up the majority of the marsh, and they are also another type of halophyte. And how they deal with the salt water is they actually secrete the salt from their blades. So if you actually are in the marsh, you can take a blade of Spartina grass and run your finger down it, and you'll actually have little grains of salt on your hand. Salty.
It's tasty. Another reason why Spartina is super important to this ecosystem, as it makes up the most of the high and low marsh. When it dies, it dies, of course, and kind of floats away, and it's carried in the tidal creeks and carried out to sea, out through the estuary to the intercoastal, and even sometimes makes it up to the beach. A lot of times it is what the rack line is made of, and that rack line is the foundation for new sand dunes, which are super important on a barrier island ecosystem, as they're kind of the front line and the shield to all of the weather coming in off the coast. So the marsh is kind of like the backup, the strength behind the sand dunes and the foundation of the barrier islands. So we'll just let these float away.
All right, so I am standing in the Tidal Creek right now. So like we said before, the marsh is heavily influenced by the tide. Twice a day, high tide comes through here and floods this area, and they do that by traveling through these tidal creeks. So sometimes these creeks, this one's rather narrow, but some creeks can be really, really wide enough that you can bring a boat through, you can kayak and canoe down them. It's a lot of fun. But a real cool thing about these tidal creeks is they also help, not only is that's where the tide is traveling through are these creeks, but there's also help forming the marsh. As this tide is flooding through these creeks, it's eroding the sand down through and depositing that sand elsewhere, and it's actually building up these hammocks. So that's how we get these hammocks in these high marsh areas, is all through these tidal creeks. And then we mentioned that it's the tide that is causing and influencing our marsh, and a lot of different things can affect the tides. Sometimes it's still sort of a mystery for scientists trying to figure out all how tides are influenced, but a big and major factor is that tides are caused by the moon's gravitational pull. So this fiddler crab right here, he's very, very big, not because he has found himself some nuclear waste or something like that, or he's been working out. But he is actually a very specific type of fiddler crab. He is called a mangrove fiddler, and typically they are more seen down in Florida in the mangroves, but due to rising temperatures, we are starting to see more and more mangrove fiddler crabs entering the marsh. So they are starting to expand their habitat and be able to live in other places. So this guy's a little beefy. Very cool.
So here in the marsh, one of the coolest things is the marsh mud. Another word for it is detritus. So it's mostly, a lot of people look at it and think, "Ugh, that's all poop." Not true. It's mostly just decomposed plant matter. All these plants out here, those different halophytes, the Spartina grass, the sea pickles, the glasswort, all of those things. And as they decompose, as Rachel said, it is a low oxygen environment, so you get this beautiful nice thick mud that the fiddler crabs eat, periwinkle snails eat. A lot of the shrimp in the tidal marshes and the tidal creeks will eat the mud as well. It's one of the reasons why Georgia shrimp is so sweet, as the Spartina grass is in the sugarcane family, so this mud is sweet to the animals that eat it. I'm not going to eat it. I'm not a shrimp. But as they do that, then you are what you eat, and they have this sweet mud that they're just filled with, and it makes eating them very sweet.
Hey Mallory, you know what also is really great for marsh mud?
What?
Putting it on your face.
As the mud is filled with sand, I suppose, it is a nice, good exfoliant.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll just get a facial.
So that was our trip through the marsh. I hope y'all enjoyed it. We had a lot of fun, and I hope y'all learned some things. So the marsh is actually a very, very important ecosystem to the state of Georgia. It has many important roles to play. One of them is that it is actually nurseries for fishes. So during those high tide moments, fish from the open ocean and crabs and things like that will come in, and they'll actually lay their eggs. And then as babies, that sea life will be protected from those larger predators in the ocean until they're ready to go out into the open ocean. In fact, 80% of our seafood industry depends on a marsh at some point in its lifetime. Another really important reason why we need our marshes is that they act as a really great storm buffer for those tropical storms and hurricanes. They absorb all that storm energy that can oftentimes cause lots and lots and lots of damage. So with those marshes around, they help minimize those impacts from those storms.
And part of the minimizing the impacts of the storm is the marshes soak up that flood water. So the marsh is already adept and adapted to high tide and low tide fluctuations, and even the holes of the fiddler crabs help with the extra storm surges, the water like dissipating and being soaked up by the mud in this habitat and ecosystem. And another really important reason for the marsh is that it is kind of a migration rest stop for birds. So we have all sorts of birds that fly through Georgia or live in Georgia, and the marsh is kind of like when you're traveling and you stop at a rest stop or a hotel, birds do the same thing when they're making those long journeys from anywhere up north to below the equator or wherever they're going south, depending on the bird. And marshes are a great place to rest. It's a nice place where they can have shelter in the hammocks. There's plenty of food with the fish and the crabs and the snails, and it's just a place that's kind of protected and quiet away from other predators and people. So anytime you come out in the marsh, you are bound to see all sorts of different types of birds that are making their way either north or south or just hanging out in the marsh for a day like we did.
Yep. And then lastly, marshes are really important because, like Maui mentioned, they're a sponge. They also soak up those pollutants from our cities and things and prevent them from going out into the ocean, which I don't really want to eat seafood that has been polluted from us. So the marshes are really good at tolerating those pollutants. So marshes are important for really, really, really number of reasons, and that's why we love them.
We love them so much.
Yep. Hope y'all enjoyed.
Thanks for exploring with us.